Imagine losing everything you've ever had, your family, your home, and your dignity, all in a matter of weeks. Now picture yourself sleeping on a cold bench night after night, clutching an old textbook as your only hope. This was Marcus's reality. But what if I told you that one unexpected encounter would change everything for him? And that the same young man, once invisible to the world, would go on to inspire thousands? How did a homeless man rise against all odds to become a college graduate? And why did he give away his very first paycheck to help others? Stay with me, because this is a story that will change the way you see kindness forever. Marcus Brown never imagined his life would take such a drastic turn. Just a few years ago, he was a young man full of hope and ambition. Raised by his grandmother in a modest but loving home, he believed that with hard work and perseverance, he could build a future he could be proud of. Marcus had dreams of going to college, becoming a social worker, and helping others rise above their circumstances. But life, as it often does, had other plans for him. And it all began unraveling the day he received a phone call that shattered his world. It was a cold, gray morning when the call came. Marcus was at his part-time job, stocking shelves at a local grocery store, when his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to pick up. A soft voice on the other end spoke words that left his knees weak and his heart racing. His grandmother, his rock, his only family, had passed away in her sleep. She was the one who had raised him, sacrificed everything to ensure he stayed on the right path. And now, she was gone. The suddenness of it left Marcus in a daze, a fog of disbelief and grief that seemed impossible to escape. With no immediate family and barely any savings, Marcus found himself in a precarious position. His grandmother's small house, the only place he called home, was not paid off. The bank moved swiftly, issuing eviction notices just weeks after the funeral. Despite his desperate pleas and attempts to find help, Marcus was left standing on the front porch of the house that held every memory of his childhood, staring at the padlock on the door and feeling utterly powerless. But things only got worse. The loss of his grandmother and the house hit Marcus hard. He tried to focus on work, determined to save up and find a new place to live. But grief has a way of creeping into every aspect of your life. He began showing up late, missing shifts, and making mistakes he never would have made before. His boss, initially sympathetic, grew impatient. One chilly evening, after arriving a mere 10 minutes late due to a bus delay, Marcus was called into the manager's office and handed his final paycheck. Just like that, he was jobless. Homelessness came swiftly, a cruel reality that Marcus wasn't prepared for. With nowhere else to turn, he wandered the city aimlessly, the little money he had slipping through his fingers for cheap motel rooms until there was nothing left. Days turned into weeks as he drifted from one temporary shelter to another, each night a battle to find a spot that wasn't already taken. The rejection and judgmental stares from passers-by stung more than the cold wind biting at his skin. Every time he asked for help or spare change, he felt the sting of humiliation, as if he was no longer a person, just a problem others wished would disappear. As the weeks dragged on, Marcus found himself sleeping on park benches, trying to catch a few restless hours of sleep while clutching the only possession that mattered to him, an old worn-out textbook on social work. It was his grandmother's gift to him when he expressed his dream of helping people. To anyone else, it was just a dusty book, but to Marcus, it was a symbol of hope. Every night, as he lay there under the stars, he would flip through the yellowed pages, the words blurring as he fought back tears of frustration and exhaustion. He read the same passages over and over, trying to cling to the belief that he still had a purpose, that he wasn't just another homeless man forgotten by society. But life on the streets was harsh and unforgiving. Days turned into a blur of hunger, loneliness, and fear. Marcus learned quickly that kindness was a rare commodity. People walked past him as if he were invisible. Some would cross the street to avoid him. Others threw cruel insults his way, assuming he was lazy or a drug addict. The shame of it all was almost unbearable. And then there were the moments that broke his spirit entirely. Like when he went into a cafe to ask for a cup of water and was told to get out, before he scared off the customers. The nights were the worst. The city's underbelly came alive after dark. Marcus often huddled in fear as the sounds of shouting, police sirens, and drunken laughter filled the air. He'd pull his thin jacket tighter around him, praying he wouldn't be noticed. One evening, he was awakened by a group of teenagers who thought it would be funny to kick his legs and call him names. The sting of their laughter stayed with him long after they left, making him wonder if maybe they were right, if maybe he was nothing more than a failure. Winter set in, and the temperatures dropped dangerously low. Without a proper coat or shoes, Marcus's health began to deteriorate. He shivered through the nights, teeth chattering uncontrollably, his fingers numb and raw. His strength was fading, and he knew he couldn't survive much longer like this. Yet through it all, he refused to let go of his dream. Each day, he forced himself to visit the library, a place of refuge where he could sit in warmth and lose himself in books, pretending, if only for a few hours, that he was still the person he used to be. It was during one of these library visits that Marcus's life took an unexpected turn. He was sitting at a corner table, his head bowed over that same old textbook, when a soft, gentle voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, young man. Are you studying?" Startled, he looked up to see an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She introduced herself as Mrs. Jenkins, a retired teacher who had noticed him coming to the library every day for weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone looked at Marcus, not as a homeless man, but as a human being. Mrs. Jenkins sat down across from him and asked about the book, about his dreams. At first, Marcus was guarded, wary of pity, but something about her genuine interest and gentle persistence made him open up. He found himself sharing his story about his grandmother, his lost job, and his desire to go to college and make a difference. By the end, his voice cracked with emotion and tears welled up in his eyes as he admitted, "I just want to be someone she'd be proud of." Mrs. Jenkins was moved. She didn't see a broken man. She saw potential, determination, and a heart that still burned with hope. "You don't belong on these streets," she told him softly. "You belong in a classroom, changing lives." And then she did something that Marcus would never forget. She offered to help him apply for a scholarship at a local community college, using her own connections to pull a few strings. For Marcus, it was as if a lifeline had been thrown into the dark, stormy waters he was drowning in. It was a chance, a fragile, precious chance, to reclaim his life. He looked down at the textbook, at the faded cover that had kept his dreams alive, and for the first time in months allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Marcus was no stranger to false hope. For months, he learned the hard way that kindness could be fleeting, and the light at the end of the tunnel was often just another oncoming train. But there was something different about Mrs. Jenkins from the moment they met in the library. While others glanced at him with suspicion or pity, she looked at him with genuine curiosity, as if she saw something beyond his tattered clothes and weary eyes. That first conversation had been short, yet filled with warmth, a kind of warmth Marcus hadn't felt in so long. The next day, to his surprise, Mrs. Jenkins returned. She offered to buy him a cup of coffee, insisting they sit down and talk properly. Hesitant but curious, Marcus agreed. As they sat across from each other, the steam from their cups curling in the air, Marcus found himself opening up again. He shared more about his childhood, about his grandmother who had taught him the value of education and always believed he could make a difference in the world. And Mrs. Jenkins listened, really listened. There was no judgment in her gaze, no condescension in her words. Instead, there was a fierce determination. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I used to teach at a school in a rough neighborhood where so many bright young minds were overlooked just because of where they came from. They were dismissed as troublemakers, as if their circumstances defined them." She paused, looking directly into Marcus's eyes. "But I see you, Marcus. I see your potential, and I refuse to let it go to waste." Her words hit Marcus like a wave, stirring something deep inside him. He had grown so accustomed to people turning away, to hearing no and sorry over and over, that this unexpected belief in him felt almost unreal. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to believe her so badly, but doubt lingered. Why would a stranger care so much? What did she want in return? But Mrs. Jenkins asked for nothing. She didn't lecture him or push him to make promises. Instead, she simply asked, "What's the one thing you want most in this world?" Marcus stared down at his empty cup, his hands trembling slightly. He thought of the countless nights spent freezing on the streets, of the sneers and insults, of the suffocating shame that had followed him like a shadow. And yet, even through all the darkness, there was one constant dream that refused to die. "I want to finish my education," he whispered, almost afraid to speak it aloud. "I want to help people who feel like I do right now. People who think they have nothing left." Silence hung between them for a moment, and then Mrs. Jenkins smiled, a smile so bright it felt like the sun breaking through the storm clouds. "Then let's make that happen." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Mrs. Jenkins, true to her word, used her contacts in the education sector to help Marcus apply for a scholarship at a local community college. She drove him to appointments, helped him fill out forms, and made sure he had everything he needed for the application process. But it wasn't just the practical support that made a difference. It was the emotional support, the steady presence of someone who believed in him without condition. There were moments when Marcus felt overwhelmed, when the weight of his past threatened to crush him. How could he go back to school, surrounded by people who had never known what it was like to sleep on a bench or beg for food? How could he fit into a world that seemed so far out of reach? But each time those doubts crept in, Mrs. Jenkins was there, lifting him up with a quiet strength. "Don't let your past dictate your future," she would remind him gently. "You've survived things that would have broken most people. That makes you stronger, not weaker." It was a slow, uphill battle. Some days Marcus felt as though he was climbing a mountain barefoot, every step excruciating and uncertain. The scholarship application required an essay about his life experiences, and writing it was like reopening old wounds. He wrote about his grandmother, about the eviction, about the nights on the streets when he thought he wouldn't make it to see the morning. But he also wrote about hope, about the dream that had kept him going even when everything else was stripped away. When he handed Mrs. Jenkins the completed essay, his hands were shaking. He half expected her to tell him it wasn't good enough, that he wasn't good enough. But instead she read it carefully, then looked up with tears in her eyes. "This is powerful," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Your story isn't just about loss, Marcus. It's about resilience, about courage. You have no idea how many people you're going to inspire." The scholarship board must have seen the same thing she did, because a few weeks later, Marcus received the letter that would change his life forever. He read it over and over, hardly able to believe the words. "Congratulations, you have been accepted with a full scholarship." He stared at the letter, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he turned to Mrs. Jenkins, who was watching him with a hopeful smile. I did it," he whispered, his voice choked with disbelief. "No," she replied softly, stepping forward to place a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We did it. You fought for this, Marcus. You earned it." It was the beginning of a new chapter, but also the end of something else. The end of Marcus's time on the streets. The end of feeling like he didn't belong anywhere. Mrs. Jenkins insisted on helping him find a small, modest apartment near the college. It wasn't much, just a single room with a bed and a desk. But to Marcus, it felt like a palace. For the first time in so long, he had a roof over his head, a place to call his own. But more than the physical space, Mrs. Jenkins gave Marcus something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. She didn't treat him like a charity case or a project to be fixed. She treated him like family. They would meet every Sunday for lunch, where she would ask about his classes, his professors, his plans. And as he spoke, she would listen, nodding thoughtfully, always encouraging him to reach higher, to believe in himself just a little bit more. It was during one of these lunches that Marcus, feeling braver than ever before, said something that surprised even himself. "One day, I'm going to do for someone what you did for me." Mrs. Jenkins smiled, her eyes shining. "I know you will, Marcus, because that's who you are." And in that moment, Marcus knew, deep in his heart, that he was no longer alone. He had a chance, a real chance to turn his life around. And it all started because one woman, a stranger who saw more than just his circumstances, chose to believe in him. College was nothing like Marcus had imagined. He had pictured it as a place of endless possibilities, a fresh start where his past no longer defined him. But the reality was far from the dream. From the very first day, he felt like an outsider, a man who didn't belong, who was constantly trying to prove he deserved to be there. It seemed like no matter how hard he tried, the shadows of his past followed him, whispering that he was still just the homeless man people overlooked on the streets. He arrived early on his first day, nerves coiling tightly in his stomach as he entered the bustling campus. Students milled around in groups, laughing and talking, their backpacks slung casually over their shoulders. Marcus clutched his only notebook and pen, a small gift from Mrs. Jenkins, in his trembling hands, feeling painfully out of place. He found his classroom, took a seat at the back, and tried to make himself as invisible as possible. But invisibility was no shield against the stares. The moment he walked into the room, conversations paused. Eyes glanced up, flickering over his worn clothes, his tired face, and the faint lines of hardship etched into his features. Whispers filled the room like a low hum, and Marcus could almost feel the judgments being passed silently around him. He kept his gaze down, focusing on his notebook, forcing himself to breathe steadily. Then the questions began. "Hey man, are you in the right class? I've never seen you around before. You a transfer student? Whoa, are you actually enrolled here?" Their words were laced with a casual cruelty, and Marcus could hear the unspoken doubts behind them. "You don't belong here. You're not one of us." He bit back the surge of anger and humiliation, telling himself they didn't know his story. They didn't know what it had taken for him to get here. So he forced a polite smile, nodding and giving short, stiff responses until they eventually lost interest and turned away. But the sense of being an imposter lingered, clinging to him like a second skin. The academic workload was overwhelming. Each night, Marcus would spend hours in the library, poring over textbooks and notes, trying to catch up to his classmates, most of whom had spent their high school years preparing for college, while he'd been struggling just to survive. He wasn't just behind, he was drowning. Concepts flew over his head in lectures, and more than once he found himself staring blankly at an exam paper, feeling panic rise in his chest. And then there was the discrimination, the subtle, almost invisible barriers that cropped up at every turn. It started small with professors who barely looked at him when he raised his hand, their eyes flicking past him as if he were just a shadow. Then came the snide comments from some of his peers, their words dripping with disdain. "Why bother, man? Guys like you don't make it here." "Yeah, like he's going to actually graduate." They didn't even try to hide their laughter. Every snicker felt like a dagger, reopening wounds he thought had healed. But it was the incident in the cafeteria that nearly broke him. It was a typical busy afternoon. Marcus had saved up a few dollars from his weekend job at a nearby fast food joint and decided to treat himself to lunch on campus, a small victory he wanted to savor. As he sat down with his tray, a group of students approached. They were the same ones who had taunted him on his first day, their faces twisted in cruel smirks. "What's up, man? Decided to join the real students today?" One of them jeered. Before Marcus could respond, they grabbed his tray and dumped its contents onto the floor, sending his meager meal scattering. The cafeteria fell silent, and for a moment, all Marcus could do was stare at the mess, his chest tightening with a mix of shame and rage. His stomach growled painfully, but he refused to bend down and pick up the food. He refused to give them the satisfaction. "Oops," one of them sneered. "Guess you're back to eating scraps, huh?" It took everything in him not to lash out, but he didn't. Instead, he stood tall, his gaze steady as he looked them each in the eye. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and walked away, his heart pounding with suppressed fury. He didn't cry that day. He didn't let them see how much it hurt. But that night, as he sat in his tiny apartment, the loneliness and pain crashed over him like a tidal wave. The weight of it all, the isolation, the constant struggle to prove himself, was suffocating. There were times when he wanted to give up, to drop out and return to the streets where at least he knew what to expect. But each time those thoughts crept in, he remembered Mrs. Jenkins's unwavering belief in him. He remembered his grandmother's dream of seeing him succeed. And more than that, he remembered the promise he'd made to himself, to never let the world define his worth. So he kept going. He threw himself into his studies with a determination that startled even his professors. He spent long nights at the library, often the last one to leave, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. He took on extra shifts at his job, scrubbing floors and flipping burgers just to make ends meet. And when the exhaustion threatened to drag him down, he would think of the people who had looked down on him, who had doubted him, and he would push himself even harder. Slowly, things began to change. He started speaking up more in class, refusing to let the whispers silence him. He sought help from professors, showing them that he was serious about his education. One professor, in particular, a stern but fair woman named Dr. Ellis, took notice of his grit and began offering him extra tutoring sessions. She had seen students come and go, but there was something about Marcus's relentless drive that caught her attention. "You're one of the hardest workers I've ever met," she told him one evening after a particularly grueling study session. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." It was a small comment, but it filled Marcus with a sense of validation he hadn't realized he craved. For so long, he'd been fighting not just for grades, but for the right to exist in that space. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could make it after all. But the real turning point came during a group project in his social work class. His team had been assigned to research homelessness in the city and propose solutions. While his classmates approached the project with a clinical detachment, Marcus spoke from experience. He knew the pain, the fear, the hopelessness of being invisible in a world that pretended not to see you. His insights were raw and real, and for the first time, his classmates looked at him not with disdain, but with respect. When they presented their project to the class, Marcus's words left everyone silent. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. He spoke of the nights he'd spent freezing, of the strangers who had spat on him, of the few moments of kindness that had kept him alive. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Afterward, one of the students who had mocked him earlier approached, his face flushed with embarrassment. I, I'm sorry," he stammered, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have." Marcus didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look in the student's eyes, the shame and regret, was enough. It was the beginning of a shift, not just in his classmates' perception of him, but in his own perception of himself. For the first time since stepping onto that campus, Marcus felt something other than fear or anger. He felt pride. The morning of his graduation was surreal. Marcus stood in front of a mirror in his tiny apartment, staring at his reflection. The sight was almost unrecognizable. A young man in a pressed cap and gown, his eyes bright with anticipation, his posture straight and proud. For a moment, he simply looked at himself, taking in the magnitude of what this day represented. It wasn't just a graduation, it was a victory, a triumph over every obstacle, every doubt, every cruel word that tried to break him. He had made it. Against all odds, he had made it. But as he adjusted the tassel on his cap, a wave of emotion washed over him. He thought about his grandmother, about the way she used to ruffle his hair and tell him he was destined for great things. A lump formed in his throat as he whispered softly, "I wish you could see me now, Grandma." He blinked back the tears that threatened to spill, knowing she was with him in spirit, beaming with pride. The ceremony was held in a large auditorium filled with students and their families, the air buzzing with excitement and celebration. Marcus took his seat among the rows of graduates, a sea of caps and gowns surrounding him. But unlike his classmates, who were laughing and exchanging stories of their time at college, Marcus sat quietly, absorbing the moment. It was almost overwhelming, the sheer enormity of it all. The journey had been long and grueling, but he had finally crossed the finish line. The commencement speaker stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. Marcus barely heard the speech. His mind was racing with memories, on nights spent shivering on park benches, days spent working menial jobs just to survive, moments of doubt when he thought he'd never get here, And yet, here he was, a college graduate. He looked around at his fellow students, many of whom had once looked down on him. But today there was no condescension, no skepticism. Today they looked at him as an equal. When his name was called, a hush fell over the crowd. Marcus stood slowly, his heart pounding as he made his way to the stage. As he approached the dean, a ripple of applause spread through the auditorium, gaining strength until it became a standing ovation. Marcus paused, stunned. He had expected polite claps, a few murmured congratulations. But this outpouring of support was beyond anything he had imagined. He turned, his eyes scanning the audience, and spotted Mrs. Jenkins standing at the back of the room, tears streaming down her face. She raised a hand, giving him a thumbs up, her expression glowing with pride. Marcus felt his own eyes sting, and he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. He accepted his diploma with trembling hands, clutching it tightly as if it were a lifeline. For a moment he just stood there, staring at the piece of paper that represented so much more than just academic achievement. It was a testament to his resilience, to every sacrifice, every moment of pain and struggle. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face, the tears shimmering in his eyes said it all. He nodded once to the audience, a silent promise that he would carry this moment with him forever. And then he stepped down, walking back to his seat amidst the roaring applause. After the ceremony, the graduates poured out into the bright sunshine, their laughter and shouts filling the air. Families clustered around their loved ones, snapping pictures, exchanging hugs, and celebrating this milestone. Marcus stood off to the side, a bittersweet smile on his face. He had made it, but he had no family here to share it with, no parents or siblings to wrap him in a congratulatory embrace. But then, just as the loneliness began to creep in, he felt a familiar presence beside him. "Congratulations, graduate." He turned, his smile widening as he saw Mrs. Jenkins standing there, holding out a small bouquet of flowers. I didn't think you'd bring flowers," he stammered, touched beyond words. "Every graduate deserves flowers," she replied gently, placing them in his hands. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus. You've accomplished something truly remarkable." They stood there for a moment, the chaos of the celebration swirling around them, and Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude swell in his chest. "I couldn't have done it without you," he whispered. "Yes, you could have," she corrected softly. "You just needed someone to remind you how strong you really are." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, sharing lunch and reminiscing about his journey. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the campus, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. His hands shook slightly as he held it out to her. "What's this?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, puzzled. "My first paycheck," he said quietly. Mrs. Jenkins blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Marcus, no. You need this money for yourself, for rent, food." "I know," he interrupted gently, pressing the envelope into her hands. "But I also know that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for people like you. And I want to help others the way you help me." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "There's a shelter downtown that's always short on supplies, especially for their educational program. I want them to use this to buy books, computers, whatever they need to give people like me a chance." For a moment, Mrs. Jenkins just stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. Then slowly her expression softened, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Marcus, are you sure?" He nodded firmly. "Yes, I don't need this money to survive anymore. But maybe it can help someone else survive. Maybe it can help someone find hope." Mrs. Jenkins swallowed hard, clutching the envelope to her chest. "You're an incredible young man," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you have any idea how much this means? You're going to change lives, Marcus, just like you always wanted." He looked down at the diploma in his hand, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. "That's the plan," he murmured, smiling softly. Word of Marcus's donation spread quickly, and before long, it caught the attention of local news outlets. They ran stories about the homeless college graduate who gave away his first paycheck, painting him as a hero. But Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He was just a man trying to pay forward the kindness that had saved him. Still, As he watched the ripple effect of his decision, people stepping up to donate, volunteers offering their time, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any material reward. This was what he had fought for. This was why he had endured every hardship, every sleepless night. Because it wasn't just about escaping the streets or proving his worth. It was about giving others the hope that had kept him going, even when everything seemed lost. Standing on that campus, surrounded by smiling faces and congratulations, Marcus knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just graduated from college. He had graduated into the person he was always meant to be. Years passed, but Marcus never forgot where he came from. Every time he looked at his framed diploma hanging on the wall of his modest office, he remembered the cold nights spent on park benches, the sting of hunger, and the way people used to look past him as if he were invisible. He hadn't just overcome homelessness, he had redefined what it meant to rise above adversity. But Marcus knew that his journey wasn't over. Now it was his turn to be the beacon of hope for those who felt trapped in the darkness, just as Mrs. Jenkins had been for him. With his degree in social work and a few years of experience under his belt, Marcus made a bold decision. He left his stable job at a community center and founded his own nonprofit organization. He called it Second Chances. It wasn't a flashy name, but it captured the essence of everything he believed in, because everyone, no matter their past, deserved another chance to rewrite their story. The early days were tough. Marcus worked out of a small, rundown office with peeling paint and a single desk. He barely had any funds, relying on donations and his own limited savings to get by. But he poured his heart into the project, spending long nights drafting proposals, knocking on doors, and sharing his story at every opportunity. Slowly, people began to take notice. Word of his organization spread, and soon Second Chances was more than just a name. It was a lifeline for dozens of men and women who had lost everything. Marcus focused on what he knew best, offering education and job training to the homeless. He set up workshops, partnered with local businesses, and created mentorship programs. But what made Second Chances different was its emphasis on restoring dignity. He remembered how crushing it had felt to be treated as less than human, and he was determined that no one who walked through his doors would ever feel that way. Everyone was greeted with respect and compassion, whether they were seeking help for the first time or returning for the 10th. One day, as Marcus was wrapping up a session on resume building, a young man lingered in the doorway, shuffling his feet nervously. His clothes were dirty, and his face bore the weary lines of someone who had seen too much suffering in too little time. But his eyes held a familiar spark, the same one Marcus had seen in his own reflection years ago. Can I ask you something?" the young man murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked up, offering a welcoming smile. "Of course, come in, take a seat." The young man hesitated, then stepped inside, glancing around the room as if he couldn't believe he was welcome. He sat down slowly, his hands clenched in his lap. I, I've been living on the streets for a while now," he began haltingly. "And I guess I just wanted to know, do you think it's possible for someone like me to start over? I mean, really start over?" The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He remembered the nights he'd asked himself the same thing, the desperate hope that maybe somehow his life could change. He leaned forward, meeting the young man's gaze squarely. "I don't just think it's possible," he said quietly. "I know it is." The young man blinked, disbelief flickering across his face. "But how do you know?" "Because I was where you are now," Marcus replied gently. "I know what it's like to feel hopeless, to wonder if you're just going to be stuck in the same place forever. But I'm here to tell you that it's not true. You can change your life. You just need someone to believe in you." The young man's eyes widened, and for the first time, a small, hesitant smile tugged at his lips. Marcus felt his heart swell. This was why he had fought so hard, why he had refused to give up. He wasn't just building an organization. He was building a community, a place where people could find not just resources, but hope. As the years went by, Second Chances grew beyond anything Marcus had imagined. Donations poured in, volunteers lined up to offer their time and skills, and the small office with its peeling paint became a thriving hub of activity. They expanded to include housing support, mental health counseling, and even a scholarship program for homeless youth, a tribute to the woman who had believed in Marcus when no one else did. But Marcus's proudest moment came one sunny afternoon when he received a letter from the mayor's office. Second Chances had been nominated for a humanitarian award, recognizing its impact on the community. Marcus stood on stage that evening, dressed in a crisp suit, a far cry from the threadbare clothes he once wore, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. As he accepted the award, he thought back to his first days at college, the doubts and fears that had nearly broken him. He wished his grandmother could have seen this, could have seen how far he had come. But as he looked at the rows of smiling faces, faces of people whose lives had been changed because of second chances, he realized that, in a way, she was there. Her dream for him had always been to help others, and now he was doing exactly that. I accept this award not just for myself, but for every person who's ever been told they're not good enough, Marcus said, his voice steady and strong. For every man and woman who's had to fight just to survive. This isn't just my story, it's their story. And I hope it serves as a reminder that no matter how dark things get, there is always hope. The applause was deafening, and Marcus felt a swell of pride and gratitude so overwhelming that for a moment he couldn't speak. He glanced out at the audience and saw Mrs. Jenkins sitting in the front row, her eyes shimmering with tears. She gave him a small, proud nod, and he knew this was for her, too. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, a small girl with wide eyes and curly hair approached him, clutching a worn-out textbook to her chest. "Mr. Marcus?" she asked shyly. He knelt down to her level, smiling gently. "Yes, sweetheart." "Can I be like you one day?" she whispered, her gaze filled with innocent hope. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He reached out, gently ruffling her hair. "You can be anything you want to be," he said softly. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise." She beamed up at him, and in that moment Marcus knew that his journey had come full circle. He had gone from being the one in need to being the one who gave, from the young man clutching a textbook on a park bench to the man inspiring others to chase their dreams. And as he stood there, surrounded by the community he had helped build, Marcus knew that he was more than just a graduate or a social worker. He was a living testament to the power of resilience, to the strength of the human spirit, and that, more than any award, any accolade, was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Thank you for staying with us through Marcus's incredible journey. His story is a powerful reminder that hope, resilience, and kindness can truly change lives. If this story touched your heart, please make sure to hit the like button, share it with others who might need some inspiration today, and don't forget to subscribe for more life-changing stories like this. Until next time, remember, every act of kindness creates a ripple of change. Stay inspired.